Most of us don't even realize just how quickly our brains make these political decisions, whether we want to or not. Not even after some deep research or proper analysis. It just happens instantly. You hear Japan and your mind probably goes somewhere nice and safe. Technology, order, politeness, anime, bullet trains, clean cities, tourists filming Tokyo in the night, all that fun stuff. But then you hear China, and the emotional reaction to that is the exact opposite.
China.
You think surveillance, authoritarianism, censorship, expansion, threat. Even for those who know almost nothing about either country, still somehow feel this distinction instinctively. Now that's interesting, isn't it? The deeper we look into both countries though, the stranger that perception actually becomes. Let's be real here, alright? Japan invaded half of Asia. China hasn't fought a major war in decades. Japan's ruling political structure was heavily shaped by the United States after the Second World War. China built itself largely in opposition to the Western world entirely. One country is described as disciplined, the other described as dangerous. One is seen as civilized influence, the other as dictatorship expansion. Yet, come to think of it, many of the accusations directed at China today could also be applied to Japan, even more so historically and even more accurately. So why is one country seen as nice, while the other feels threatening? Why do Western audiences especially love Japan, but then fear China? The answer to that question, I think, may not just be about politics or human rights. I think it's power, I think it's about alignment, and more than that, more than anything, it's about who shapes the global narrative. For decades, the Western governments believed history had already been written. The Cold War was over, the Soviet Union collapsed, American influence dominated the planet. The good guys won, right? For a while, it genuinely felt like that. Permanent, set in stone, so to say. Hollywood, the internet, global finance, military alliances, news media, culture itself, the American dream. The modern world increasingly looked American. Countries that aligned with the United States economically and politically were gradually absorbed into what became known as the international order. Japan became one of its greatest success stories. But China didn't need all that. China took a completely different path. It opened its markets, sure, without fully opening its political system. It embraced some aspects of capitalism without surrendering state control. It became deeply integrated into global economy while remaining ideologically separate from the Western model itself. You have to be the United States and you're thinking to yourself, that wasn't supposed to happen. According to many Western assumptions, economic liberalization was supposed to eventually create a way for political liberalization as well. I mean, it's common sense, right? But instead, China got richer, more technologically advanced, more globally influential, more independent, more without becoming Western. It changed everything. Once China stopped looking like another developing country in the other side of the world, it stopped being viewed as a partner and slowly started being seen as a proper rival. And you know what? Maybe that fear is justified. Maybe China really is becoming dangerously powerful. Maybe that whole surveillance thing, the censorship and military expansion, the pressure on Taiwan really do represent the rise of a new authoritarian superpower. But if that's the case, then another uncomfortable question comes to mind. How come global power from some countries are seen as stability while others are threats? That question, more than China itself, might explain the entire modern geopolitical era. If we really want to understand why Japan feels trusted today, we have to start with the moment modern Japan was rebuilt. 1945. Picture this. World War II ends and Japan is devastated. Its cities are destroyed. The supposed forever empire collapses. Their military is completely dismantled, and for the first time in modern history, the country falls under foreign occupation led by the United States. And what happens next would shape not only Japan's future, but the psychological map of modern politics itself. You see, post-war Japan wasn't simply defeated and left to rot. It was redesigned. from political institutions that were restructured to the military that was restricted, as for the constitution was rewritten under heavy American supervision. Most importantly, Japan was forced into Article 9, a constitutional clause that formally renounced war itself. That's the big one. Symbolically, that mattered enormously. Within a single generation, Japan's global identity began transforming from brutal imperial military power into technological pacifist ally, on the surface at least. That very transition is one of the most successful national rebrands in modern history. Not to mention, the timing alone couldn't have been more strategic for the West, because immediately after the Second World War came the Cold War. The thing is, the United States wasn't just rebuilding Japan out of some newfound sense of generosity. Can you imagine? No. Japan became strategically a valuable asset. Geographically, it sat directly beside China, Korea, the Soviet sphere, and the broader Pacific theater, which meant Japan was no longer viewed primarily as a former enemy. It was now viewed as a frontline ally against communism in Asia, kind of like the first line of defense. And because of that, the United States heavily invested in Japan's recovery. Its economy expanded rapidly, industries were modernized, their infrastructure developed, its exports exploded globally. But hold on now, economic rebuilding was only part of the transformation. The deeper change was psychological. Over time, Japan became integrated into the so-called Western-led international order. Japan's security became closely tied to the United States. American military bases remained stationed all over Japan. The two countries developed this deep political and economic alignment. So gradually, the image of Japan changed. The memory of Imperial Japan, the expansionism and occupations, the wartime atrocities began fading into the broader Western imagination. It gets even weirder, especially when compared to Europe's memory of Nazi Germany as it is. The Cold War accelerated that process even further.
Fallout shelter in your basement will give adequate shielding from radioactive fallout.
There was an understanding amongst Western leaders that anti-communism often mattered more than historical actions or memory. In fact, we have declassified documents now that shows during the Cold War, the CIA covertly supported conservative political factions inside Japan, not because democracy was unachievable on its own, but simply because Cold War politics reshaped priorities everywhere. Across multiple countries, Western intelligence agencies supported governments and political movements they believed would resist socialist or communist influence, no matter the cost. Japan was just one of them. And over time, as a result, one party in particular became dominant: the Liberal Democratic Party. The LDP has gone on to govern Japan for most of its post-war era. Now, whether you believe that makes Japan some kind of one-party or puppet state, well, but it does show something important. Our modern views of countries are usually not formed naturally like most people would think. They are formed through alliances, media narratives, economics and security relationships, and long decades of geopolitical alignment. By the late 20th century, Japan no longer felt like the terrifying empire many countries once feared to the Western world, that is. It now felt stable and predictable, a safe haven for Western ideals in Asia. And once a country becomes psychologically associated with stability to the powers that be, everyone of course stops looking at it through the lens of threats, even when their history remains unresolved. But I'm not gonna bore you with geopolitics alone, because that doesn't even fully explain why Japan became trusted like it is now. Here's the thing: most people don't experience countries through military alliances or constitutional law and all that jazz. They experience them emotionally first, through the country's culture, their media, products, and this is where Japan did something few countries in modern history have ever achieved. It became globally familiar, with Western aid of course. By the 80s and 90s, Japan wasn't just exporting cars and electronics anymore. They were exporting their identity as is. I mean, look at all this: Nintendo, Sony, Pokemon, anime, Studio Ghibli, PlayStation, manga, Tokyo aesthetics, Japanese food, fashion, tourism. Entire generations across the world grew up consuming Japanese culture before they ever understood the real Japanese history. That's as psychological as it gets. Am I allowed to say that's one of the biggest psyops in history? Look, familiarity creates comfort, even if it's subconsciously. Most Western audiences encountered Japan not as a military power, but as childhood entertainment through technology, art, food, music, and aesthetics. Japan became emotionally integrated into global pop culture. And like I said, once that happens, a country stops feeling foreign and starts feeling personal. The image itself is now part of the brand. Importantly, the transformation happened during the exact same decades that China remained comparatively closed off from much of the Western world. So get this, while Japan became culturally accessible, China remained politically distant. What were they up to? Public perception is rarely shaped by historical actions alone. It is more so shaped by repetition. What people see repeatedly becomes normal, and what feels normal becomes safe. And Japan became deeply normalized inside Western cultural consciousness on a deep emotional level, which exposes an uncomfortable truth that many people in the West feel more emotionally connected to Japan through anime, gaming, technology, all that, than they do to neighboring Asian countries that have entirely different historical experiences of Japan. We all know that history depends heavily on perspective, on the winner's perspective, right? So, for the West, Japan's post-war image became associated with innovation and culture, but in parts of China, Korea, and much of Southeast Asia, historical memory remains a lot differently. And that disconnect still exists today. While Japan was becoming globally associated with comfort and modernity, on the other side of the world, many wartime wounds in that region never fully disappeared, and rightfully so.
A museum built on the former site of a prisoner of war camp run by the Japanese during World War II has opened in Shenyang City, as well as exhibiting belongings of prisoners who were detained in the camp between 1941 and 1945.
To this day, Japan still refuses to fully acknowledge the Nanjing massacre, with no formal apology or official recognition ever truly issued.
50年前の当時の指導者がしたことを過ちと断定して、謝られる権利が村山総理に終わりだとお考えなんでしょうか。総理自身が日本国を代表して、謝る反省の意を表明するというの結構なんですけれどもね、何をもって侵略行為というのか、何が過ちなのか、この辺が明確に見えないとですね、勝手に代表して謝ってもらっちゃ困ると私は思うわけでございます。
The Chinese and others still remember the brutality they suffered from them ever so vividly. That difference in memory alone is where opinions become much more divided.
掌管政策，杀光烧光，就是抢光，这是掌管政策。但是到我们家来的时候是这样子，当时那个邻居伯伯死了，我妈呢抱了一个小妹妹1岁的，仍然坐在桌子底下的，还有邻居家妈妈呢带2个小孩也在桌子底下，都在桌子底下。但是他看他们死了，他喝的也不敢动了，都在桌子底下。但是这个日本兵呢，爬上去就把我妈拖出来，拖出来以后就把我1岁的妹妹抢过来，这边抢过来，活活的炸死了，炸在院子里，炸死了，炸的鬼叫火喊的，叫你们那边去了。然后啊，他还日本鬼子啊拿那个枪杆子刀，惹得1岁的小孩。我母亲呢，后来就也在叫喊。但是还有那个邻居家妈妈抱2个小孩，也是都在桌子顶里头，他拽不出来，因为那个上面很重，门有皮门，有大门，估计那个大门就是大门，还有那个有压着石头，还把那个，但是反正就拽不出来，他拿枪打，把小孩打死了，活活的把那个邻居妈妈拿腿敲断了，也拿枪打死。就一下我叫的没得命了，就是在那个外边，就是外面一下头。
While much of the world was learning to associate Japan with this new soft power, another side of Japan's history never disappeared at all, especially across large parts of Asia. Imperial Japan was not simply another wartime state caught in global chaos. Across most of the continent, the Japanese Empire carried out some of the most brutal military campaigns of the 20th century, even prior to the Second World War. The invasion of China alone resulted in mass civilian deaths on a catastrophic scale. Cities were destroyed, entire populations were displaced, forced labor operations expanded across occupied territories. Atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre are enduring symbols of generational trauma across modern Chinese historical memory, past and present. The same goes for Unit 731, a Japanese covert biological and human experimentation program that took place in occupied China, something akin to the German concentration camps both in scale and villainy. Even today, the details remain difficult to discuss because of just how disturbing they are. Across multiple occupied territories, there are still unresolved historical disputes involving forced labor, wartime sexual slavery, civilian massacres, and the treatment of prisoners of war. None of this is historically controversial, but what is controversial is how these similar histories are remembered internationally. Unlike Germany, where public confrontation of their past Nazi history is central to modern German identity through memorials and statues, Japan's post-war historical memory is much more largely unaddressed. We see it in controversy surrounding the Yasukuni Shrine, where several convicted wartime leaders are enshrined. Any visits by Japanese politicians often trigger outrage to the Chinese and others who see these visits as symbols of unresolved imperialism. Globally, Germany remains permanently associated with the horrors of Nazi fascism, as it should. But Japan, despite committing massive wartime atrocities across the continent, has been gradually reintegrated into global order with far less lasting stigma in much of the Western world. Now, why is that? Well, partly because Europe experienced Nazi Germany directly. But there's another reason. Remember how Japan became allied with the Western Bloc during the Cold War? Yeah? So all that geopolitical priority changed. Former enemies became allies and allies became friends. Japan's historical narrative softened, which means economic cooperation expanded and cultural integration accelerated. So shortly after a few decades, the emotional image of Japan transformed faster internationally than the historical wounds disappeared regionally, which also explains something important: why conversations about Japan can sound completely different depending on where you are in the world. In the West, Japan is often imagined through rose-colored glasses, a haven of politeness and kawaii. In China or Korea, historical memory remains inseparable from occupation, mass violence, forced assimilation, and unresolved wartime trauma. Two entirely different realities are present at the same time. So understanding that contradiction is essential, because just like Japan, the modern perception of China is shaped by historical memory too, just in a different direction. For most of modern history, past couple centuries or so, China was not viewed as a global power. I know that might sound hard to believe, but it was viewed as a collapsing one. Too many mouths, not enough food to go around. By the 19th century, China had been weakened by foreign intervention, internal instability, economic decline through colonial pressure, and repeated humiliation by outside powers, including Japan. And for those decades, many Western political thinkers assumed China would eventually follow the same trajectory as other industrializing states. Like I said earlier, economic liberalization, then political liberalization. That assumption shaped enormous parts of Western foreign policy during the late 20th century, especially after China began opening its economy under Deng Xiaoping. Factories expanded and foreign investments flooded in. Global cooperation moved production into China. Trade exploded overnight. And by the time China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001, many Western leaders believed integration into the global economy would gradually transform China politically too. Talk about being cocky. Because that isn't what happened. Instead, China did something far more unexpected and brilliant. It became enormously capitalist in production while remaining politically controlled by a one-party socialist state. That combination changed the entire geopolitical century. Over the next 2 decades, China's rise happened at a scale modern history had rarely seen before. Entire cities emerged almost overnight. Infrastructure expanded at a staggering speed. High-speed rail networks spread across the country. Manufacturing capacity exploded. China simply became the industrial center of the global economy. Eventually, it stopped simply manufacturing products for the world and started competing technologically with the West itself. EVs, AI, robotics, battery technology, telecommunications, renewable energy, advanced manufacturing, you get the idea. Industries that many Western countries assumed they would permanently dominate suddenly faced serious Chinese competition. And while most of the Western world was still trying to wrap their head around what to do, China went from being just the factory of the world to becoming a peer competitor to the United States itself. On all accounts, economically, technologically, militarily, geopolitically, that last one might even be more important. Even to a point now that senior US military officials, including policymakers, are comfortable to openly describe China not as a regional problem anymore, but as the most significant long-term strategic challenge to American global dominance. Let's just pause and understand the emotional contrast that's going on here, right? Japan's rise after World War II happened largely inside a Western-led system. China's rise did not. Japan became integrated into American geopolitical architecture. China increasingly became positioned against it. That difference changes perception before any individual policy on any head of state meeting is even discussed. Because countries that are seen as integrated allies are usually interpreted through the language of stability, through partnership and cooperation, while countries seen as a systemic rival are interpreted through the language of threat of expansion, competition, and risk. Also, it's important to note that China's rise coincided with another important shift: the decline of confidence inside many Western societies themselves. With rising inequality, housing crisis, political polarization, distrust in institutions, at the exact same time that China was presenting itself as efficient, rapidly developing, technologically ambitious, and increasingly influential across the global south. Projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, China expanded infrastructure investments across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even parts of Europe. Now, to supporters, this looks like welcome development and multipolar cooperation. To critics, however, it looks like strategic influence expansion through debt and dependency. Again, guys, same action, different interpretation. That's just geopolitics, isn't it? Once a country becomes viewed primarily as a rival, nearly every action it takes starts being interpreted through suspicion. So much so that even its successes are put under scrutiny. And in the 2020s right now, China is challenging something fundamental. This assumption that Western liberal democracies would permanently dominate the global order after the Cold War. But that possibility, more than any single policy, may be what truly shakes the modern world going forward.
I think that the Chinese have created a pretty impressive system. It's quasi-market-based, and they are very successful at marshaling new technology. They're capable of innovating a lot of things we thought they weren't able to do. And conversely, democracy, especially American democracy, looks like it's falling apart. If I were somebody trying to move from a poor, misgoverned country somewhere else, I would have chosen the United States without question for most of the last several decades. But these days, I'm not sure that it's such an attractive model for many people. And I would say if the Chinese keep their development machine going, it may turn out that they have a real alternative.
But hey, at this point, it's important to slow down for a second. There are legitimate reasons many people distrust the Chinese state. Modern China is not simply viewed as powerful, it is viewed as powerful and opaque. The Chinese government openly maintains one of the most extensive state surveillance systems in the world. Facial recognition networks, internet censorship, digital monitorings, and restrictions on political dissent, essentially a heavy control over domestic media. Now, the argument is that these systems create a society where the state possesses enormous visibility into public life. Sure. And those in favor would argue that that kind of surveillance helps maintain stability, reduce crime, prevent the kind of political fragmentation visible in many countries. Yet again, it comes down to different interpretations of the same reality. Taiwan is a perfect case study for this. From the perspective of the Chinese government, Taiwan is not a separate country. It is part of China under the One China framework. From Taiwan's perspective and from much of the West, the issue is tied to democracy and self-governance and the threat of forced unification, which means Taiwan has become one of the most dangerous geopolitical flashpoints, especially as military tensions in the region continue increasing. The same thing applies to the South China Sea. China argues that most of these territorial claims are rooted in historical sovereignty and strategic security concerns. Critics would say that China has increasingly militarized disputed waters, expanded artificial islands, and pressured neighboring countries. And because global trade routes pass through directly, the stakes are enormous. But there's another layer to that fear that needs to be addressed. For many people in the West, China represents something larger than just another country. It represents an alternative model of the modern world, a technologically advanced, economically powerful, and globally influential state that did not politically liberalize in the same way Western academics predicted. That alone creates deep ideological anxiety amongst Western leaders, especially after the Cold War, when many believed liberal democracy had effectively won history. A belief that shaped an entire generation of Western political thinking, and then here comes China actively complicating that assumption. Because instead of collapsing, the Chinese system adapted. So whether people see that as efficient governance or dangerous authoritarianism often depends heavily on their broader political worldview. Now, obviously, China is not the only major power responsible for surveillance and military expansion or global influence operations. The United States and its allies have their own long histories involving mass surveillance, coups, proxy wars, military bases, economic pressure, and intelligence operations, as they like to call it, across the world. That's just objectively true. Still, many Western societies fundamentally perceive China as being unfamiliar and systematically a rival. While countries aligned with the Western order, even when they're exercising power aggressively, often interpret it as operating inside the savior framework. Japan, for much of modern Western convenience, has now been fantasized. Its culture became exportable, its aesthetics are familiar, its politics became aligned with the post-war international order. Never mind its violent, brutal history that has become romanticized over time. China followed a completely different trajectory. It rose outside the influence of the Western world, became powerful without becoming an ally. That combination creates anxiety to the established order, because rising powers are usually tolerated more easily when they feel culturally integrated into said existing order. China doesn't care, but at the same time, China's rise has exposed contradictions inside modern geopolitics itself, because now, for the first time in decades, that assumption of Western dominance no longer feels guaranteed. An era where power is no longer uncontested, so it makes sense why one Asian state became associated with safety and another became associated with threat. All it boils down to is about how power becomes normalized, depending on who controls the narrative. Thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting, do like and subscribe, and I'll see you all on the next one. Peace.
You can be democratic at home and ruthlessly imperial abroad. The most violent country in the world since 1950 has been the United States. It's been by far involved
Jeffrey,
in
stop now. Let's Jeffrey, I'm Jeffrey, I'm your moderator, and it's enough.
Okay, I'm done.